The Cure?
Yeah.
I thought you were with 4.
No, we're 3.
I once read that you were called the Pink Floyd of the 80s. What do you think of that?
Shit. We're not at all. They're the Cure of the 80s.
In the year of our Lord 2022, we constantly hear stories and see videos talking about disturbing albums and records so dark they'll kill your family at 3 a.m. or however those stupid videos go. Seldom is what they talk about any more than just obscure trash or an intentionally edgy mess of noise and distortion thrown onto Bandcamp only to elicit cheap shock, or in many cases, to have some stupid YouTube video made about it. But there do exist a fair few albums that genuinely do push past this threshold and stand as some of the most haunting pieces of music ever made. One of these records just so happens to be written by a songwriter more well known for his sappy love songs and bright red lipstick. The songwriter is none other than the legendary Robert Smith, and while he's best known for timeless albums like Wish or Disintegration, some of his finest work came in 1982 on The Cure's 4th full-length album, one that I think is one of the darkest and most haunting records to ever be released, and that record is Pornography.
I mean, why bother to call us the Pink Floyd of the 80s when all you've got to do is listen to the record and make up your own mind?
By this point, the story of The Cure is ingrained into music history, being one of the frontrunners of the post-punk and goth music scenes during the late 70s and early 80s, etching themselves into music history with their innovative songwriting and far-reaching influence. But back in 1981, this wasn't really the case. The Cure was still young, the band itself only being about 3 years old at this point, having released 3 albums and already seen some lineup changes and shifts in musical direction. While they had already seen some early success with songs like Boys Don't Cry and The Forest, the road they were on was still extremely rocky. Robert Smith himself had become incredibly jaded with the music industry, and in particular, the idea of charting songs and the pop music industry.
Are you conscious of say the charts? I mean, like with your records. I mean, sometimes I get this feeling you're not even interested in the charts.
No, we're not really. I mean, obviously people who release our records are interested in the charts.
Right.
There's always a certain amount of pressure put on you to have a hit record, but I don't really think for a group like us it's that worrying, because I mean there's always going to be an audience for people who never get into the charts. I mean, there's very few groups that we like between the 3 of us that actually do ever get into the charts anyway. There's just a few exceptions. Well, the charts are a reflection of obviously of like a general taste, and I think the general taste is usually pretty vile, and it's awful because most people are.
If it wasn't extremely apparent from the interview, Robert Smith is not in a good place at this time, still mourning the loss of his grandparents, who were the inspiration for the band's previous record, Faith. He was also dealing with physical and mental exhaustion from playing over 200 shows in a year and the heavy overuse of alcohol and LSD. Robert Smith would later say that during this time he felt he was at a crossroads with only 2 choices to make. I had 2 choices at this time, which were either completely giving in or making a record of it and getting it out in time. He would later remark that his goal was to write the ultimate fuck off record and quit the band. At his worst, he even remarked how he had reached the point where he wanted to kill himself. If this all sounds like a recipe for disaster, well, it gets a lot worse. Due to the constant touring and low payouts, the band was dead broke and spent most of their money that they had on band-related expenses. They opted to sleep at the offices of their label Fiction Records during the recording, and while this might have saved them money, it did come at the cost of their relationship with Fiction. Not completely, but it absolutely resulted in some tension, especially when Fiction got some of the early releases from the album and saw that there was no real commercial value to it. At the end of the recording sessions for Pornography, Robert Smith had essentially destroyed his life outside of the band. In an interview, he remarked, "At the time, I lost every friend I had, everyone without exception, because I was incredibly obnoxious, appalling, and self-centered." Despite all of this, the album would see release on May 3rd, 1982. The lead single, The Hanging Garden, peaked at number 8 on the UK singles chart, and the album sold relatively well. Despite this, it was given lukewarm and even outright negative reviews by critics, while Rolling Stone only gave the album 2 stars, calling the album persistently dull, and it comes off as a, I quote, "oral equivalent of a bad toothache." Ouch. In the end though, Pornography would be looked back upon with fondness for just how uncompromising and influential it was, becoming a classic among many of The Cure's discography. Now, let's talk about the actual album. Pornography came out during the early days of the 80s and could easily be described as the antithesis of what the decade would be known for. The album is one of the darkest and most challenging pieces of music one could ever listen to, at least in commercial standards, boasting an extremely nihilistic and foggy atmosphere, completely barren of poppy choruses or any real semblance of joy. The album kicks off with the track 100 Years, instantly setting the tone with its repetitious drums and shrieking guitars. Robert Smith belts out lyrics describing his feelings of dread and discontentment with post-industrial life. Caressing an old man and painting a lifeless face, just a piece of new meat in a clean room. The soldiers close in under a yellow moon, all shadows and deliverance under a black flag. 100 years of blood, crimson, the ribbon tightens around my throat. I open my mouth and my head bursts open. A sound like a tiger thrashing in water. Chilling stuff, to say the least. Though at this point in the early 80s in London, it was easy to see why young Robert Smith would see the world through such a decadent lens and in more of a, how shall we say it, Uncle Ted kind of way. The song is also named after the 100-year war between France and England. Following 100 Years comes the song A Short-Term Effect, one of the few songs that retains some DNA from The Cure's earlier sound on Three Imaginary Boys. A Short-Term Effect is a song that drives at a mid-tempo and plays with repetition to create constant tension. Robert sings about drugs here, but not with any real admiration for them. A day without substance, a change of thought, an atmosphere that rots with time, colors that flicker in water, a short-term effect. The song is an existential exploration of the short-term effect of taking drugs, the way they distort your reality and ultimately leave you hollow. But it's also a reflection of the drive that comes to take them, especially when you're living in what you perceive as a existential and nihilistic and pointless world, as the band did at this time. And given their heavy use of alcohol and LSD during the writing process of this record, it's easy just to see where this all came from. At this point, the album takes a bit of a detour with its third track, The Hanging Garden, Pornography's sole single. The song itself shares the most DNA with its predecessor Faith, relying on a tribal drum beat and fast-paced bass riff, with Smith singing about God knows what. When asked about the song's meaning, Robert Smith remarked that it was supposed to be about the purity and hatred of animals fucking or something like that, and while that might be his own excuse, the way I see it, the song is less than a positive look at the hedonistic way people are beginning to treat sex and relationships at the time. This was the early 80s, and well into the hippie free love movement. Creatures kissing in the rain, shapeless in the dark again. In a hanging garden, change the past. In a hanging garden, wearing furs and masks. Following this, we reach the track Siamese Twins, where the album really begins to kind of calm down, at least for this track, lowering the tension a bit and letting the dread of the album really start to sink in. Like falling angels, the world disappeared, laughing into the fire. It was always like this. Flesh and blood and the first kiss. The first colors, the first kiss. The lyrics are a blatant reflection of sexual trauma, and while it's never been confirmed by the band, many fans speculate the meaning of the song being about a traumatic first sexual experience, and the narrator's twisted and morbid feelings about everything. Dancing in my pocket, worms eat my skin. She glows and grows with arms outstretched, her legs around me. In the morning, I cried. I mean, come on. With lyrics like this, I'm sure we can see just how dark this song actually is. And speaking of dark, we reached the second half of the record and one of its most haunting songs, the Figurehead. This song continues with a similar theme as what we heard on Siamese Twins. Robert sings of losing himself in Chinese art and American girls as he laments his choices, feeling shame and guilt for taking pleasure in his inhibitions. Too many secrets, too many lies, writhing with hatred. Too many secrets, please make it good tonight. But the same image haunts me, in sequence, in despair of time. I will never be clean again. I touched her eyes, pressed my stained face. I will never be clean again. The pain in Robert Smith's voice pairs perfectly with the lyrics, showing this wasn't just a concept to him, but the life he was actually living. Not knowing how to cope with the emptiness and discontentment he felt, but finding nothing but pain and misery in the drugs and girls he buried himself in. And that's not even mentioning the sound of the music. The band playing a slow and driving song that almost sounds like a post-punk take on the Black Sabbath sound of doom metal. Just replace the weed with peyote, and that's a good way to describe the overall vibe this record gives off. The next track of the album is Strange Day, a song that can best be described as evil new wave. Its fluttering and pretty synths are accompanied by a slow downbeat drum rhythm and a driving bass line, all with Robert's trademark vocals floating above them like a hazy fog. My head falls back and the walls crash down, and the sky and the impossible explode. Held for a moment, I remember a song, an impression of sound. Then everything is gone forever. The lyrics on this song are some of the album's most haunting as they explore the idea of the world ending and the feelings that would come with them. Unlike the pretentious takes we hear on these types of songs today, Strange Day feels much more real because, well, it was written during the heat of the Cold War, when doomsday via nuclear fallout was not just a fear in people's head, but a real possibility. And it was more than likely another cause for the existential dread the band was feeling at the time. The last two tracks in the album are Cold and the album's title track. Cold is one of the most interesting songs in the record because out of everything on this album, it's the closest to the sound that the band would later adopt for Disintegration. Cold is another song dealing with everyone's favorite pastime, drugs. Though in this case, Robert talks about them as if they were a scorned ex-lover. Scarred, your back was turned, curled like an embryo. Take another face, you will be kissed again. I was cold as I mouthed the words and crawled across the mirror. And await the next breath. The lyrics of this song show just how dependent Robert had become to substances at the time. He sings with a lot of conflicting opinions in regards to his struggles with substance. And, well, now we've reached the conclusion of the record. the album's title track, Pornography. And without fail, The Cure saved the most haunting for last. This track is nothing short of a monster, starting off with a dreary ensemble of warped and reversing voices, creating a claustrophobic and strange atmosphere. And while you wait for the track to really open up, it never actually does, instead doubling down on its claustrophobic atmosphere, with the band playing slightly off-key with each other and the reverb of the room sounding extremely tight. The lyrics themselves are more dysphoric imagery of violence and degeneracy, though unlike the album's opening track, there is a distinct lack of connection, the band's way of showing just how nihilistic and far gone they had felt at the time, letting the record fade out with no light at the end of the tunnel, leaving us to now stew in its darkness and think about everything that we just heard. The Cure's Pornography is a challenging and painful listen, but very worth the effort, and something that could only have been made by people who were truly struggling at the time. Though obviously the band did get through most of this, and Robert never committed self-sunset, going on to write some of the most legendary records of all time, even following a Pornography with its polar opposite, The Top, a very bright, upbeat, and psychedelic record, especially when contrasted with the dark, nihilistic ambience of Pornography. And not just Pornography, but The Cure in general, I have to say, I can't recommend them enough. They've earned their stripes. They are a classic band for a reason, and almost all their records have something special to jump into. But with all that being said, subscribe, support me on Patreon, follow me on Twitter. I'll see you in the next video.
It's me, Madison Ray, playing up your pathetic little babe pitties.